What we're going to do is we're going to start graphing sine and cosine curves. What we're going to look at first is our basic sine curve and cosine curve. These are the parent functions. And what we mean by the parent functions is the original before they're shifted up, down, left, right. Now, our normal sine values are 0, 1, 0, -1, and back to 0 when we get to 2 pi. Remember, 2 pi is the same thing as 360 degrees. So they go up, back down, and then back up again. Now, cosine, if we're looking at it, is similar. But with cosine, what we have is it starts at 1, and that goes to 0, down to -1, and then back to 0, and then back up to 1 again. And so this right here is our cosine curve. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to add a vertical translation. This is also called a midline, and this shifts the graph either up or down. The horizontal is the center of our graph. So when we're looking at our first one, what we're going to do is I'm going to fill out the table, and I have my chart, and the theta values are always going to be the same: 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. I'm using my same sine values. So my sine values are 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. Now what I'm going to do is with each one of those sine values, I'm adding 2 to it. So 0 plus 2 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, back to 2. Then I have -1 plus 2 is 1, and then back to 2 again. So when I graph this, what I have is my 2 pi. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going up to 3. And when I graph it, I have 2, 3, back to 2, back to 1, and then back to 2. Now notice that my midline is the middle of the graph, and that right there is a positive 2. So whatever my C value is, that right there is my midline. It shifts the graph up and down. So if we look at our original graph, it looks identical. The only difference is the original, the midline is at 0. And then with the positive 2, it's shifting the graph. So it looks identical, and it's just going up 2. So let's look at cosine. So with cosine, we have the same 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Now, when we're graphing this, our normal cosine curves are 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. Now, this time we're subtracting 1 from each of them. 1 minus 1 is 0. 0 minus 1 is -1, -2, back to -1, and then what we have is 0. So when we're plotting this, what we have is 0, 0, then 0, -1, -2, back to -1, and then we have 0 again. So what we have is our cosine curve. Once again, when we're looking at it, looking at the original, notice that it's identical. The only difference is that with the original, the midline is at 0. In this case, the midline is at -1. The reason that it's at -1 is because we're subtracting 1. So here what we have is sine. So we have the 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. For our sign values, we have 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 3 from each of them. So -3, -2, back to -3. Then I have -4, and then back to -3. So with this right here, when I'm plotting it, what I have is 0, -3, and then I have -2. And then I have back to -3, and then -4, and then back to -3. So if I'm looking at my sine curve, notice that my midline is at -3. The middle of the graph is at -3. And the reason why is because it's -3. Now, pause the video and try these next 3 on your own and see how you do. For letter D, we have our normal values, 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And our normal cosine values, remember, are 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. So what we're doing here is we're adding 3 to each of those values. 1 plus 3 is 4, 0 plus 3 is 3, -1 plus 3 is 2, back to 3, and 4. So when we graph this, what we're doing is we're going up to 4. So we have 0, 4, 3, 2, back to 3, and then we have 4. So if we're looking at this curve, notice where is our midline? Our midline is at 3. And the reason that it's at 3 is because we're adding 3 to each of the cosine values. For the next one, this time we're doing sine, and our midline is -2. So we have 0, 1, 0, -1, and back to 0. Now, we're subtracting 2 from each of these. So 0 minus 2 is 2. 1 minus 2 is -1. Back to -2, -3, and then back to -2. So when we plot this, we have 0, -2, -1, back to -2, -3, and -2. And that's our graph. Now, looking at letter F. This time we have cosine, and our midline is -2. And the reason that we know that is our constant value is -2. So we have 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Our cosine values are 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. So when we subtract 2 from each of them, we get -1, -2, -3, back to -2, and -1. So graphing this, we have 0, -1, -2, -3, back to -2, and -1. And this right here is our curve. Once again, when we're looking at this, we see that the midline is -2, and that's because our constant value we're subtracting 2.